The Pacific Ocean is vast, so vast it covers nearly a third of the planet. During World War II, this ocean became a battlefield larger than any in human history. It was a war fought across thousands of miles of water on tiny islands of volcanic rock and coral that most people had never heard of. How do you win a war like that? How do you project power across an entire ocean? You don't do it with courage alone. You do it with machines, you do it with ideas turned into steel, wires, and explosives. This wasn't just a conflict of ships and planes. It was a war of engineers, scientists, and factory workers. It was a race to build better, faster, and smarter, an advantage of a few 100 feet in altitude, a few miles per hour in speed, or a few minutes of warning could mean the difference between life and death for thousands. Some technologies were revolutionary, born in secret laboratories. Others were simple, brutal, and effective. Some were brilliant successes from the start. Others were catastrophic failures that had to be fixed in the middle of a shooting war. Together, they formed a web of innovation that slowly, painstakingly turned the tide. What were these tools? And how did they truly change the fate of millions? Number 15. What if your best weapon was a lie? In the early days of the Pacific War, American submariners were in a tough spot. They were the tip of the spear, sent deep into enemy waters to choke the Japanese Empire's supply lines. They had courage. They had well-built Gato-class submarines, and they had the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, or BUORD, claimed was the best in the world. There was just one problem. It didn't work. The Mark 14 was a complex piece of machinery. It was supposed to be a wonder of technology. It had a magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, designed to detonate the torpedo right under a ship's keel. This would break the ship's back, a far more effective kill than a simple hole in the side. It was also designed to run at a specific preset depth. On paper, it was a killer. In reality, it was a dud. Submarine commanders would risk everything to get into a perfect firing position. They would stalk a target for hours, sometimes days. They would endure depth charge attacks, they would fire their torpedoes, hear them hit the target with a dull thud, and then some even ran in a circle, coming back to sink the submarine that fired them. The crews called them duds, erratics, and worse. Morale in the submarine force plummeted. They were risking their lives for a weapon that was fundamentally broken. The problem was BUORD. The Bureau was incredibly arrogant and insular. They had tested the torpedo in carefully controlled, unrealistic conditions. They refused to believe the reports coming back from the front lines. They blamed the submarine commanders, accusing them of poor tactics, bad aiming, and cowardice. For almost 2 years, the pleas of the submariners were ignored. The brass insisted the weapon was fine. It was a classic case of institutional pride blinding an organization to a fatal flaw. The change began with the submariners themselves. They started doing their own tests, in the field, under combat conditions. One key figure was Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, who took command of the Pacific Submarine Fleet in early 1943. He listened to his men, he believed them. Another was Commander Dudley Mush, Morton of the USS Wahoo, a legendary skipper who documented his torpedo failures with meticulous detail. The first breakthrough came with the depth problem. In the summer of 1942, submariners proved the Mark 14 ran about 10 feet deeper than it was set for. BUORD had tested the torpedo with a dummy warhead, not a live one, and failed to account for the difference in weight and balance. Lockwood ordered his crews to set their torpedoes to run at 0 depth for surface targets. This helped, but the duds continued. The next problem was the magnetic exploder, the Mark 6. It was too sensitive. It could be set off by the magnetic field of a target ship, but it could also be set off by the Earth's own magnetic field near the poles or by random magnetic anomalies. It was also just poorly designed. In mid-1943, Lockwood finally got permission to deactivate the magnetic exploders and rely on the simple contact exploder, the part that was supposed to go off when it hit the side of a ship. But even then, the torpedoes still failed. The contact exploder itself was flawed. It was designed to hit a target at a perfect 90-degree angle. If it hit at an oblique angle, which was common in combat, the firing pin mechanism would jam. It took a dramatic field test in August 1943, ordered by Lockwood, to finally prove this. They fired torpedoes into a cliff face in Hawaii. The ones that hit straight on exploded. The ones that hit at an angle were duds. Finally, with undeniable proof, BUORD was forced to act. They redesigned the contact exploder's firing pin, making it stronger and more reliable. By late 1943, almost 2 full years into the war, the U.S. submarine force finally had a torpedo that worked as advertised. The impact was immediate and devastating. Once the Mark 14 was fixed, the American submarine campaign became one of the most effective commerce raiding operations in history. U.S. submarines sank over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5.3 million tons. This was about 60% of the entire Japanese merchant fleet. They also sank over 200 warships, including battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers. They starved Japan of oil, rubber, iron, and food. The Japanese war machine ground to a halt not just because of battles won, but because its logistical lifeline was severed, torpedo by torpedo. The book Silent Victory, The U.S. Submarine War Against Japan by Clay Blair Jr. chronicles this campaign in exhaustive detail. The transformation from a failing force to a lethal one hinged on fixing this one piece of technology. The Mark 14 torpedo story is a chilling lesson in the dangers of institutional arrogance. It forces us to ask some hard questions. How many American submarine crews, hundreds of men, were lost on eternal patrol because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to listen to their frantic reports? What internal documents and memos from board meetings during 1942 and 1943 were destroyed or classified to cover up their catastrophic incompetence? And what other perfect weapons in modern arsenals today might have a hidden fatal flaw that will only be discovered when it's too late? Number 14, can a simple truck win a war? The war is not just about fighting, it's about moving. Moving people, moving food, moving bullets, moving fuel. The Pacific War was a logistical nightmare. It involved crossing oceans, then hacking through dense jungles, climbing volcanic mountains, and navigating muddy, primitive roads on remote islands. You could have the best soldiers in the world, but if you can't get them to the battle, and can't supply them once they're there, they are useless. In this environment, a simple, rugged vehicle could be more important than a tank, and the Allies had the best one ever made, the Jeep. It wasn't officially called the Jeep at first. Its designation was Truck, 1 4-ton 4x4 Command Reconnaissance. It was born from a U.S. Army request in 1940 for a light, all-terrain vehicle. The specifications were demanding. It had to be four-wheel drive, have a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, a track of no more than 47 inches, and weigh less than 1,300 pounds. A tiny company called American Bantam Car Company came up with the initial design, but they couldn't produce them in the numbers needed, so the design was given to Willys Overland and Ford. Over 640,000 were built during the war. What made the Jeep so special? It was simple, tough, and incredibly versatile. It was a masterpiece of utilitarian design. There was nothing on it that didn't need to be there. The engine was a reliable 60 horsepower Go Devil engine. It could handle almost any terrain: mud, sand, rivers, steep hills. It was light enough to be loaded onto landing craft, carried in gliders, and even lifted by a few strong soldiers if it got stuck. It was easy to fix. Mechanics in the field could practically take it apart and put it back together with a basic set of tools. In the Pacific, the Jeep became the workhorse of the war. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, it was indispensable. It served as a command car for officers, a reconnaissance vehicle for scouts, and an ambulance for medics, strapping litters across the hood. It was used to lay communication wire, to tow small artillery pieces, and as a machine gun platform. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, wrote extensively about the Jeep. He said it did everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. He believed, along with many soldiers, that the Jeep was one of the most important pieces of equipment in the war. The Japanese military had nothing that could compare to it. Their standard truck, the Type 94, was a six-wheeled vehicle that was larger, less maneuverable, and less reliable. While the Americans were zipping around islands on their Jeeps, building airfields and supply dumps, Japanese forces were often stuck relying on animal power or their own 2 feet. This gave the Americans a massive advantage in operational tempo, the speed at which they could move, concentrate forces, and exploit opportunities. The construction of the Lido Road, a treacherous supply route cut through the jungles of Burma to supply China, is a prime example of the Jeep's importance. It was the only vehicle light and nimble enough to navigate the early unfinished sections of the road, keeping the project moving forward. In the book War is a Funny Business by Dick Wolfsey, a collection of veteran stories, soldiers recount using Jeeps to do everything from plowing fields for victory gardens on occupied islands to being rigged with flanged wheels to run on narrow-gauge railway tracks. The Jeep's impact wasn't just tactical, It was a symbol of American industrial power. The ability to churn out hundreds of thousands of these reliable vehicles and ship them across the world was something Japan's industry could not match. It demonstrated a different philosophy of warfare. It wasn't just about exquisite, high-performance weapons. It was about mass-produced, reliable, and practical tools that could solve the everyday problems of a global conflict. The humble Jeep solved more of those problems than almost any other piece of hardware. The story of the Jeep seems straightforward, a tale of American ingenuity. But it leaves some things unanswered. The original design came from Bantam, a company that was essentially pushed aside. How much of the final, successful Willys and Ford designs was directly copied from the Bantam prototype, and how little credit did that small company truly receive? With over 640,000 built, how many were lost to accidents, combat, or simply abandoned on remote islands? And what is the environmental legacy of all that rusting steel left behind? And, perhaps most intriguingly, what secret modifications were made to Jeeps by soldiers in the field for specialized, unofficial missions that were never recorded in any manual? In number 13, how do you burn down a city made of paper? The air war in the Pacific was different from the war in Europe. In Europe, the targets were often stone buildings and steel factories. In Japan, the cities were different. For centuries, Japanese homes had been built from wood, bamboo, and paper. They were densely packed, separated by narrow streets. This construction made them incredibly vulnerable to fire. The U.S. Army Air Forces initially tried the same high-altitude, precision daylight bombing strategy they used in Europe. It was a failure. The B-29 Superfortress bombers had to fly at over 30,000 feet to be safe from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. At that altitude, they encountered something they had never faced before: the jet stream. These were winds of over 200 miles per hour that threw their bomb sights off and made accurate bombing nearly impossible. After months of frustrating and ineffective raids, a change in strategy was needed. It came from General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a blunt, cigar-chomping, and ruthless commander. He looked at the problem and came to a simple, brutal conclusion. If precision bombing wasn't working, they would stop trying to be precise. Instead of targeting individual factories, they would target the cities themselves. And instead of using high explosive bombs, they would use incendiaries. The weapon for this new strategy was napalm. Napalm wasn't a complex technology. It was a chemical powder that, when mixed with gasoline, created a sticky, flammable gel. It was developed by a team of chemists at Harvard University led by Louis Fieser. The gel consistency was key. Unlike pure gasoline, which would splash and burn out quickly, napalm stuck to surfaces. It stuck to walls, roofs, and people. It was incredibly difficult to extinguish. Water often just spread the flaming gel around. LeMay's plan was radical and high risk. He ordered the B-29s to fly at night, at low altitudes of 5,000 to 9,000 feet. This would put them within range of anti-aircraft guns, but it would also place them below the jet stream, making their bombing more accurate. It would also save fuel, allowing them to carry more bombs. To save even more weight and increase their bomb load, he ordered most of the defensive machine guns and ammunition removed from the bombers. He was gambling that the Japanese night fighter force was too weak to be a major threat. He was right. The first major firebombing raid was against Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945. It was codenamed Operation Meeting House. Over 300 B-29s took off from the Mariana Islands. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. The result was a catastrophe beyond imagination. The small fires started by the bombs quickly merged into a massive firestorm, a self-sustaining blaze that created its own hurricane-force winds. The firestorm heated the air, causing it to rise rapidly. Cooler air rushed in from the sides to replace it, creating winds that fanned the flames and spread the fire faster than people could run. The water in the city's canals boiled. People who jumped in to escape the flames were boiled alive. The fire was so intense it created an updraft that tossed the multi-ton B-29s around in the sky. In one night, nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo were burned to the ground. The official death toll is estimated at around 100,000 people, mostly civilians. More people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than in the initial blast of the atomic bombs at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history. This was just the beginning. Over the next 5 months, LeMay's B-29s systematically firebombed 67 Japanese cities. They used a mix of napalm-filled M69 incendiary bombs and high explosives to hamper firefighters. The campaign destroyed Japan's war economy, which was heavily reliant on small cottage industry workshops located in residential areas. It also broke the will of the Japanese population. The book The Fog of War by Robert S. McNamara, who was a statistical analyst for LeMay during the war, provides a cold, analytical look at the efficiency of this campaign. It was dehousing, demolition, and destruction on an industrial scale. The use of napalm and firebombing raises profound moral questions that are still debated today. Was it a military necessity to shorten the war and avoid a bloody invasion of Japan, or was it an act of mass terror targeting civilians? How many of the scientists who developed napalm, like Louis Fieser, truly understood or wrestled with the human consequences of their creation? Given the horrific effectiveness of the firebombing campaign, were the atomic bombs truly necessary to force Japan's surrender, or was the country already on the verge of total collapse? And what does it say about warfare that a simple chemical gel could become one of its most horrifying and destructive tools? Number 12. How do you save a soldier bleeding in a jungle? The Pacific War was fought in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, soldiers faced not just the enemy, but also a host of diseases: malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and scrub typhus. A simple cut from a piece of coral or a shrapnel wound could quickly become infected in the hot, humid climate, leading to gangrene and death. In the early part of the war, your chances of dying from disease or infection were often higher than your chances of being killed by a bullet. Two medical breakthroughs changed that calculus entirely: penicillin and blood plasma. Penicillin was a miracle. The discovery of its antibiotic properties by Alexander Fleming in 1928 was one of the great accidents of science. But turning that laboratory curiosity into a mass-produced drug was a massive industrial and scientific challenge. It was a joint effort between British and American scientists during the war. Researchers at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, figured out how to purify it. But it was American pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck, using new deep fermentation techniques developed at a government lab in Peoria, Illinois, that figured out how to make it in huge quantities. By 1944, there was enough penicillin being produced to treat every wounded Allied soldier. In the Pacific, its effect was transformative. It could stop infections in their tracks. Soldiers with deep wounds, compound fractures, or burns, who would have almost certainly died from infection just a year or two earlier, could now be saved. It was administered by medics on the front lines and in field hospitals just behind the fighting. It dramatically reduced the number of amputations and the mortality rate from wounds. The second key innovation was the use of dried blood plasma. A soldier who was badly wounded could die from blood loss or shock long before they could be evacuated to a hospital. Whole blood was difficult to transport and store, as it required constant refrigeration and had a short shelf life. And Dr. Charles R. Drew, an African-American surgeon, revolutionized the process. He developed a method for separating plasma, the liquid part of blood, from the blood cells. This plasma could then be dried into a powder, sealed in a sterile container, and shipped anywhere in the world. On the battlefield, a medic could simply mix the dried plasma with sterilized water and administer it through an IV. This would restore the patient's blood volume, treat shock, and keep them alive until they could get to a surgeon. The plasma kits were carried by medics into the heart of the battle on places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They saved countless lives. The program to collect blood from civilians back home, spearheaded by the American Red Cross, became a massive national effort. The sight of the plasma kit, with its 2 bottles and tubing, became a symbol of hope on the battlefield. Together, penicillin and plasma represented a revolution in military medicine. As documented in the book, The Golden Age of Medicine, the story of the great medical discoveries of the 20th century by L.S. Goodman, these technologies, along with advances in surgery and sanitation, meant that a wounded American soldier in 1945 had a better chance of survival than in any previous war in history. The death rate for American troops from disease was a fraction of what it had been in World War I. This had a huge impact on morale. Soldiers fought harder, knowing that if they were hit, they had a real chance of making it home. The success of penicillin and plasma seems like an unqualified good. But there are still unsettling questions. Dr. Charles Drew, the pioneer of the blood plasma program, later resigned from his position in protest of the military's policy of segregating blood by the race of the donor, a policy with no scientific basis. How deeply did this institutional racism compromise the war effort's medical logistics? With the mass production of penicillin, did we inadvertently kickstart the modern problem of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, creating future medical challenges we are still dealing with today. And what experimental drugs and medical procedures were tested on soldiers in the Pacific under the extreme pressures of war, the results of which may still be buried in classified medical archives. Number 11. How do you refuel a fleet in the middle of an ocean? The defining feature of the Pacific theater was distance. The ocean was a vast, empty expanse. A fleet of warships, especially the aircraft carriers that were the heart of the U.S. Navy, were thirsty for fuel. They also consumed enormous amounts of ammunition, food, and replacement parts. In the early war, a fleet could only operate for as long as the fuel in its tanks lasted. When it ran low, it had to break off from the combat zone and sail thousands of miles back to a safe harbor like Pearl Harbor or Ulithi Atoll to refuel and rearm. This gave the enemy a predictable rhythm to exploit. The fleet would strike, then withdraw, leaving a window of vulnerability. The solution was a logistical innovation that was as important as any weapon underway replenishment. The concept was simple in theory, but incredibly difficult and dangerous in practice. It meant refueling and resupplying warships while they were still at sea, in motion. This allowed the fleet to stay on station, in the fight, for months at a time. It completely changed the nature of naval warfare. The technique involved a specialized fleet of oilers and supply ships. An oiler would steam a parallel course to a warship like an aircraft carrier or battleship. Heavy lines would be fired from one ship to the other. Then, large fuel hoses would be suspended on these lines and connected to the warship's fuel intakes. Both ships had to maintain the exact same speed and heading, often in rough seas, just a few dozen yards apart. A mistake by either ship's helmsman could lead to a catastrophic collision. Doing this at night under radio silence to avoid detection by enemy submarines was even more nerve-wracking. This process, known as replenishment at CRAS, was perfected by the U.S. Navy's Service Squadron 6 and later Service Squadron 10, under commanders like Admiral Raymond Spruance, who understood its strategic value. And they created a fleet train or logistics tail that could meet the combat fleet at a prearranged rendezvous point far from any base. It wasn't just fuel, they also transferred ammunition, food, mail, and even replacement aircraft and personnel. Bombs and torpedoes would be sent across on lines in nets. Men would be transferred between ships in a precarious little chair called a boatswain's chair, dangling over the churning water. The book The Two-Ocean War by Samuel Eliot Morison details how this capability gave the U.S. Pacific Fleet a persistence that the Japanese Navy could not match. The Japanese fleet was still largely tied to the old model of returning to base to refuel. They had fewer oilers and had not developed the techniques for routine, large-scale underway replenishment. This meant that after a major battle, even a successful one, the Japanese fleet often had to withdraw, while the American fleet could stay in the area, rearm, and press its advantage. This logistical dominance was a quiet, unglamorous, but decisive factor. The great carrier raids of 1944 and 1945, which struck targets from the Philippines to the Japanese home islands, would have been impossible without the fleet train. It allowed Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet and Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet. They were the same ships and crews, just renamed depending on who was in command to maintain a constant, relentless pressure on the Japanese Empire. The war became a siege, and the besieging army never had to leave. Underway replenishment was a triumph of seamanship and logistics. But it was also incredibly dangerous work. How many sailors were killed or maimed in replenishment accidents, crushed between ships, struck by parting lines, or lost overboard that were simply recorded as non-combat deaths? The technique required immense coordination. What secret codes and rendezvous procedures were used to ensure the vulnerable, slow-moving supply ships met the combat fleet without being intercepted by enemy submarines? And could a modern navy, so dependent on complex satellite communication, still pull off this kind of operation under the conditions of total radio silence that were common in WWII? Number 10. How do you build an airport on a jungle island in a week? The American strategy in the Pacific was called island hopping. The plan was to bypass heavily fortified Japanese-held islands and instead capture more lightly defended ones, then turn them into forward operating bases. But a captured island was just a piece of rock and jungle. To be useful, it needed a harbor, supply depots, barracks, and most importantly, an airfield. It needed to be transformed from a primitive wasteland into a modern military base, and it had to be done in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, often while still under enemy fire. The people who did this were the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, better known as the Seabees. Their motto was "Can Do." It was more than a slogan, it was a promise. The Seabees were a unique military unit. They were not traditional soldiers. They were recruited from the civilian construction trades, heavy equipment operators, electricians, carpenters, plumbers, welders. They were older on average than the Marines or soldiers, and they were experts in their fields. They were given basic military training, and then turned loose on the captured islands with their bulldozers, cranes, and dynamite. The Seabees' impact was immediate and profound. On Guadalcanal, after the Marines captured the partially completed Japanese airfield, it was the Seabees who landed and, under constant shelling and bombing, finished it. They named it Henderson Field. That airfield was the critical piece of terrain that allowed American air power to control the skies over the island, which ultimately led to the American victory in the brutal six-month campaign. As the war moved across the Pacific, the Seabees' accomplishments became legendary. They would land right behind the first waves of Marines. While the fighting was still going on at one end of an island, the Seabees would be at the other end, bulldozers clearing away jungle, graders leveling the ground for a runway. They built roads where there were only jungle tracks. They constructed piers and wharves on beaches. They built hospitals, fuel tank farms, and chapels. They distilled fresh water. They strung up power lines. They essentially built entire American towns from scratch on top of smoldering battlefields. One of their most famous feats was on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. This island was chosen as the primary base for the B-29 Superfortress bombers that would strike Japan. The Seabees landed in July 1944 and began what was, at the time, the largest construction project on Earth. They built 4 massive 8,500-foot runways for the B-29s, plus taxiways and hard stands for hundreds of bombers. According to historian William Bradford Huey's book, Can Do, The Story of the Seabees, at the peak of construction, they were moving Earth at a rate comparable to the building of the Panama Canal. This ability to create infrastructure out of nothing, at incredible speed, was a massive force multiplier. It meant that every island the U.S. captured could be quickly turned into a dagger pointed at the next objective. The Japanese, by contrast, built their island bases slowly, mostly with manual labor. They could not match the mechanized speed of the Seabees. When the Americans captured a Japanese base, they were often shocked at how primitive the construction was compared to what the Seabees could achieve in a fraction of the time. The Seabees didn't just support the war effort, they accelerated it. The Seabees were builders, not professional soldiers, but they often had to fight. How many Seabees were killed in action while defending the very bases they were building, their stories overshadowed by those of the frontline combat troops. The Seabees were masters of improvisation, often creating tools and solutions on the fly. What remarkable inventions or construction techniques were developed in the field by these skilled tradesmen that were never officially documented? And what long-term environmental damage was done to these fragile island ecosystems by the rapid large-scale construction projects that paid little attention to anything other than military necessity? Number 9. What is more powerful than a battleship? A boat that can drive onto a beach. For centuries, the logic of naval warfare was that ships fought ships, and armies were transported on ships, but the two didn't mix well at the shoreline. An army trying to land on a hostile beach was one of the most vulnerable military operations imaginable. The soldiers had to climb down nets from large transport ships into small boats, which would then ferry them towards the shore. The whole process was slow, chaotic, and a perfect target for defenders on the beach. The U.S. victory in the Pacific required dozens of these amphibious landings, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. A new technology was needed to make them possible. That technology came in 2 forms, the LCVP and the LST. The LCVP, or landing craft vehicle personnel, was better known as the Higgins boat, named after its creator, Andrew Higgins. Higgins was a flamboyant boat builder from New Orleans who designed and built shallow draft boats for loggers and oil drillers in the Louisiana bayous. His boats could run right up onto a riverbank or beach without damaging the propellers. The military took notice. The Higgins boat was a simple, flat-bottomed boat made of plywood. It was about 36 feet long. It could carry 36 soldiers, or a small vehicle like a jeep, or about 8,000 pounds of cargo. Its most important feature was its bow ramp. The boat would run straight onto the beach, the steel ramp would drop, and the soldiers could run out directly onto the sand, providing them with a small amount of protection from the boat itself. It was a cheap, mass-produced, and incredibly effective design. Over 23,000 were built during the war. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, said that Higgins was the man who won the war for us. Without the Higgins boat, he argued, the major landings in both Europe and the Pacific would have been impossible. The LCVP solved the problem of getting soldiers from ship to shore. But what about the heavy equipment? The tanks, the artillery, the big trucks. For that, another new type of ship was needed, the LST, or landing ship tank. The LST was a strange-looking vessel. It was over 300 feet long, with a flat bottom and a massive pair of doors at the bow. It was an ocean-going ship that could sail thousands of miles across the Pacific, but its flat bottom also allowed it to run directly aground on a beach. When it beached, the bow doors would open, a ramp would drop, and tanks, trucks, and artillery could roll right off onto the shore. The LST was the key to logistical support for an invasion. It could deliver the heavy firepower and supplies that the first waves of infantry needed to survive and push inland. The soldiers gave it the nickname Large, Slow Target because it was slow and clumsy, making it vulnerable to enemy submarines and aircraft. But it was indispensable. Over 1,000 LSTs were built during the war. They became the backbone of the amphibious forces. A typical invasion force would include hundreds of LCVPs launched from larger transport ships, and dozens of LSTs bringing the heavy gear directly to the beach. This family of landing craft, from the small LCVP to the large LST, completely changed amphibious warfare. And it turned it from a desperately risky gamble into a systematic industrial process. The book Iwo Jima Legacy of Valor by Bill D. Ross vividly describes the beaches of Iwo Jima, choked with a traffic jam of these landing craft, ferrying men and material ashore under horrific fire. They were the conveyor belt of the invasion, the bridge of boats that connected the power of the American fleet to the shores of the enemy. Andrew Higgins was a civilian who revolutionized naval warfare, often clashing with the Navy's traditionalist bureaucracy. How many other brilliant ideas from civilian inventors were rejected by the military during the war, because they didn't come from a respectable source? The LST was a vital but incredibly vulnerable ship. How many were lost with all hands, their stories forgotten because they were unglamorous support vessels, not famous warships? And what happened to the thousands of these landing craft after the war? How many were scuttled, sold for scrap, or simply left to rot on the beaches of remote Pacific islands? Number 8. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? Naval combat, for most of history, was a daytime affair. You found the enemy with lookouts, men with powerful binoculars scanning the horizon. At night or in fog or rain, fleets were half blind. A surprise attack in the dark could be devastating. The Battle of Pearl Harbor itself was a demonstration of the power of surprise. The technology that changed this, that gave ships and planes electronic eyes, was radar. Radar, which stands for radio detection and ranging, was one of the most secret and decisive technologies of the war. The basic principle is simple. A transmitter sends out a pulse of radio waves. If these waves hit an object, like a ship or an airplane, they bounce back. A receiver picks up the echo. By measuring the time it takes for the echo to return, the system can calculate the distance to the object. By using a directional antenna, it can determine the direction. This information was displayed as a blip of light on a cathode ray tube screen. In the Pacific, radar changed everything. The U.S. Navy began installing radar sets on its warships in 1941, but the early models were primitive. As the war progressed, the technology rapidly improved, thanks in large part to the work of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, a massive scientific effort that employed thousands of physicists and engineers. They developed more powerful, more accurate, and more compact radar systems. One of the first decisive uses of radar in a surface battle was at the Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. An American cruiser-destroyer force, using its new SG surface search radar, detected a Japanese force at night long before the Japanese lookouts spotted the American ships. The Americans were able to cross the T of the Japanese formation and open fire with devastating surprise. An even more dramatic example came a month later at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. On the night of November 14 to 15, 1942, the American battleship USS Washington, commanded by Captain Willis Lee, found itself in a chaotic, close-range night battle. The other American battleship, the South Dakota, had suffered an electrical failure and was dead in the water, illuminated by Japanese searchlights. The Japanese battleship Kirishima and her escorts were closing in for the kill, but the Washington's radar operators had a clear picture of the battle. Using only his radar information, Lee maneuvered his ship and directed his main battery of 16-inch guns. In 7 minutes, the Washington fired 75 main gun rounds at the Kirishima, scoring at least 9 hits. The Japanese battleship was turned into a burning wreck and sank a few hours later. It was a stunning victory, made possible entirely by radar. As James D. Hornfischer recounts in his book Neptune's Inferno, it was the moment the U.S. Navy proved it had mastered night fighting. Radar was just as important for air defense. Radar on aircraft carriers could detect incoming Japanese air raids from over 100 miles away. This gave the fleet's combat air patrol CAPI time to get airborne and intercept the attackers far from the carriers. It turned a surprise attack into a planned interception. It was also installed in night fighter aircraft, allowing them to hunt for enemy bombers in complete darkness. The Japanese were far behind the Americans in radar technology. Their systems were less reliable, less powerful, and they didn't produce them in the same numbers. This radar gap gave the U.S. Navy a consistent and often decisive advantage in battle after battle, especially at night and in poor weather. It was a secret weapon that allowed them to see in the dark. Radar operators were a new kind of warrior, staring at glowing screens in dark rooms, interpreting abstract blips of light. How much psychological stress did these men endure, knowing that the lives of thousands of their shipmates depended on their ability to distinguish a real target from a false echo or sea clutter? Were there major friendly fire incidents where ships or planes were sunk by their own side because of radar misidentification that remained classified? And what were the early failed radar experiments? What bizarre designs and dead-end technologies were tested before the successful systems were developed? Number 7. How do you read your enemy's mind? Of all the weapons in the Pacific War, one of the most effective was invisible and silent. It wasn't a bomb or a torpedo, it was information. The ability to intercept and read the enemy's secret, coded radio messages, was a strategic advantage of incalculable value. The American effort to break Japanese codes was a massive, top-secret operation. The intelligence it produced was codenamed Magic. The Japanese military used a variety of complex code and cipher systems. For their highest-level diplomatic traffic, they used an electromechanical cipher machine that the Americans nicknamed Purple. For their main naval operational code, they used a system the Americans called JN-25. This was a codebook system where words and phrases were represented by 5-digit numbers. These numbers were then further encrypted using an additive cipher. It was a complex, multi-layered system designed to be unbreakable. The work of breaking these codes was done by a small, brilliant group of cryptanalysts, mathematicians, and linguists working in secret locations like Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by the eccentric genius Commander Joseph Rochefort. They were not traditional military men. They were puzzle solvers working grueling hours in windowless basement rooms. Breaking JN-25 was a monumental task of pattern recognition, statistical analysis, and sheer intellectual brute force. It was like solving a giant crossword puzzle with tens of thousands of pieces, written in a language you barely understand. By early 1942, Rochefort's team had made a crucial breakthrough. They couldn't read every message, but they could piece together enough fragments to get a good idea of Japanese plans. Their greatest triumph came in May 1942. They intercepted a flood of messages indicating that the Japanese were planning a massive naval operation. By piecing together call signs, message traffic patterns, and partially decoded messages containing code words like AF, Rochefort became convinced that the target was the tiny atoll of Midway. The admirals in Washington were skeptical. They thought the target was elsewhere, maybe the Aleutian Islands, or even the west coast of the United States. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, trusted Rochefort. He gambled everything on the magic intelligence. He positioned his 3 available aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, in ambush to the northeast of Midway. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese fleet, commanded by Admiral Nagumo, steamed towards Midway, completely unaware that the Americans knew they were coming. The resulting Battle of Midway was a stunning victory for the United States. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. The Japanese lost all 4 of their heavy carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. It was a catastrophic blow from which the Japanese Navy never fully recovered. It is often called the turning point of the Pacific War, and it was a victory made possible by code breaking. The book And I Was There by Admiral Edwin T. Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, gives a first-hand account of the tension and triumph of this intelligence coup. Magic continued to provide crucial intelligence throughout the war. In April 1943, it led to one of the most famous targeted assassinations in history. The U.S. intercepted a detailed message outlining the flight plan of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. Army Air Force's P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched to intercept his transport plane, and he was shot down and killed over Bougainville Island. This was a major blow to Japanese morale. Code breaking was America's secret ear, listening in on the enemy's most private conversations. The story of Midway is often told as a triumph of American intelligence. But what if Rochefort had been wrong? What if Nimitz's gamble had failed and the U.S. carrier fleet had been destroyed? Would the public ever have been told that the disaster was based on a cryptanalyst's hunch? The codebreakers were under immense pressure. What was the personal toll on these men, like Rochefort, who were essentially living inside the enemy's mind? And are there still encrypted Japanese messages from the war sitting in archives that have never been broken and might contain information that could change our understanding of certain battles or decisions? Number 6. What's the best way to sink a merchant ship? With a wolf that hunts alone. The Japanese Empire was an island nation with few natural resources. To fuel its war machine, it had to import almost everything: oil, rubber, iron ore, food. This all came by sea on a fleet of merchant ships called Marus. The American strategy to defeat Japan relied on severing these arteries. The weapon chosen for this task was the submarine, and the primary tool was the Gato-class fleet submarine. The Gato class and its successors, the Balao and Tench classes, were a significant leap forward in submarine design. They were large, long-range boats, over 300 feet long. They were designed to operate for months at a time, thousands of miles from base in the vast Pacific. They had a surface speed of over 20 knots, which was fast enough to chase down most merchant ships. They were armed with 24 torpedoes and a deck gun. They were packed with advanced technology for the time, including sophisticated sonar and, later in the war, radar. They were not stealthy, silent hunters like modern nuclear submarines. They were essentially submersible torpedo boats that spent most of their time on the surface, especially at night, and only dived to attack or to escape from enemy destroyers. The American submarine campaign started poorly. As we've seen, the Mark 14 torpedo was a disaster. But once the torpedo problems were fixed in late 1943, the submarine force became brutally effective. The submariners were a special breed of volunteers. They lived for months in cramped, hot, foul-smelling steel tubes. The tension was constant. A depth charge attack was a terrifying experience, with the submarine's hull groaning and popping as explosions went off around it. But their impact on the war was immense. Unlike the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, which used wolfpack tactics of multiple submarines attacking a convoy, the American submarines in the Pacific generally hunted alone. The vast distances of the Pacific made coordinating wolfpacks difficult, so American skippers became lone predators, stalking their prey along Japan's vital shipping lanes. They sank oil tankers, troop transports, and cargo ships. The numbers tell the story. The U.S. submarine force made up less than 2% of the entire U.S. Navy, but it accounted for over 55% of all Japanese ships sunk during the war. They destroyed Japan's merchant marine. By 1945, Japan's oil imports had been cut by over 90%. Its factories were idle for lack of raw materials, its people were facing starvation, the submarines imposed a silent, invisible blockade that was slowly strangling the empire. The book Clear the Bridge by Richard H. O'Kane, one of the top American submarine aces, provides a visceral, minute-by-minute account of what it was like to be on a war patrol. The submarines didn't just sink merchant ships, they also took a heavy toll on the Japanese Navy. They sank 8 aircraft carriers, a battleship, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The USS Archerfish famously sank the brand-new Japanese carrier Shinano in November 1944, the largest warship sunk by a submarine in history. Submarines also played a vital role in reconnaissance and in rescuing downed American pilots. The Gato-class submarine was the perfect tool for a war of attrition fought across an ocean. The American submarine campaign was incredibly successful, but it came at a high cost. 52 U.S. submarines were lost during the war, with over 3,500 crewmen. This was the highest loss rate of any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. What were the final moments like for the crews of those 52 lost boats, whose fates are still largely unknown? The campaign targeted merchant ships, which often had civilians on board. What is the full, unrecorded story of the non-combatant casualties of the submarine war? And what technological secrets were learned from captured Japanese submarines, or technology that influenced post-war American submarine design? Number 5. How do you beat the world's best fighter plane? At the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was the king of the sky. It was a beautiful, deadly aircraft. It was incredibly agile, could outturn any American fighter, and had a phenomenal rate of climb and a very long range. These Zero pilots were some of the best trained and most experienced in the world. For the first year of the war, American pilots in planes like the F-4F Wildcat were at a serious disadvantage. They survived by using team tactics like the Thatch Weave, developed by Commander John Thack, to cover each other's tails. But what they really needed was a better plane. That plane was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not a revolutionary design. It was an evolution of the F-4F Wildcat. The engineers at Grumman, a company nicknamed the Iron Works for their tough, durable planes, listened closely to the feedback from combat pilots. They learned what was wrong with the Wildcat and what was right with the Zero. They designed the Hellcat to beat the Zero by leveraging American strength's raw power and ruggedness. The Hellcat was the opposite of the Zero. The Zero was light and delicate. The Hellcat was big, heavy, and brutally powerful. It was powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the same engine used in several other successful American fighters. The Zero had almost no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. The Hellcat was built like a flying tank. It had heavy armor plating around the cockpit and engine, and its fuel tanks were lined with rubber that would seal up if punctured by a bullet. It was armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns that could shred a fragile Zero in a short burst. The Hellcat could not outturn a Zero. But it didn't have to. American pilots were taught new tactics that played to the Hellcat's strengths. The Hellcat was much faster than Zero in a dive and had a better roll rate, so pilots were taught to use boom and zoom tactics. They would use their superior engine power to climb above the Zeros, then dive on them, make a single firing pass, and then use their speed to zoom back up to altitude, never getting into a slow speed turning fight. The Hellcat entered service in mid-1943, and its impact was immediate. It was easy to fly, stable, and could absorb an incredible amount of damage and still bring its pilot home. Novice American pilots in Hellcats could hold their own against experienced Japanese pilots in Zeros. The kill ratio of the Hellcat against Japanese aircraft was an astonishing 19-1. F-6F Hellcat pilots were credited with shooting down over 5,200 enemy aircraft during the war, more than any other Allied aircraft in the Pacific. The most famous demonstration of the Hellcat's superiority came on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American carrier pilots in their Hellcats, guided by radar and aided by the new proximity fuse, met a massive Japanese air attack. The resulting air battle was so one-sided that one American pilot was famously heard to exclaim, "Why hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot saw over 300 Japanese aircraft shot down for the loss of only a handful of American planes. The Hellcat had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat was a triumph of practical, iterative engineering over revolutionary but flawed design. It raises a question how many experimental, high-performance American fighter prototypes were passed over in favor of the more reliable, good-enough design of the Hellcat. The Hellcat was designed specifically to defeat the Zero. How would it have fared against the more advanced German fighters of the time, a matchup that rarely occurred? And what happened to the thousands of Hellcats after the war? How many of these history-changing aircraft were simply scrapped, their value as weapons of war disappearing overnight? Number 4. What is a floating city that launches thunder? The battleship, with its massive guns, had been the queen of the seas for centuries. The attack on Pearl Harbor proved that this era was over. The new capital ship, the weapon that would decide the fate of the Pacific, was the aircraft carrier. At the start of the war, the U.S. Navy had a handful of carriers. To win, it needed more. It needed a fleet of them. The answer was the Essex-class aircraft carrier. The Essex-class was a new design, laid down before the war, but incorporating many of the lessons learned in the early carrier battles. They were large, fast, and capable. They were over 870 feet long, and could carry nearly 100 aircraft, a mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. They had a powerful steam turbine propulsion system that could drive them through the water at over 30 knots, fast enough to keep up with any warship and to generate enough wind over the deck for launching and landing planes. The key to the Essex-class effectiveness was its design for rapid and efficient flight operations. It had a strong flight deck, a large hangar deck below it, and 3 elevators to move planes between the two. One of these was a deck-edge elevator on the side of the ship, a new innovation that didn't create a hole in the flight deck, allowing for more deck space and a stronger hull. This design allowed them to launch and recover aircraft at a much faster rate than previous carriers. An Essex-class carrier could launch a full strike of over 50 aircraft in a matter of minutes. 24 Essex-class carriers were ordered, and 17 of them were completed and saw service during the war. They began entering the fleet in 1943 and formed the core of the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Ships with names that became legendary: Essex, Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga. This fleet of floating airfields steamed across the Pacific, projecting American air power thousands of miles from home. The Fast Carrier Task Force, with its dozens of carriers, including the smaller Independence-class light carriers, was a self-contained weapon system. It was protected by a screen of new battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all bristling with anti-aircraft guns. As described in the book The Fleet at Flood Tide by James D. Hornfisher, this force was able to sail into enemy waters, launch devastating airstrikes against Japanese-held islands or the Japanese fleet itself, and then withdraw, all while defending itself from counterattack. It was the tool that made the island-hopping campaign possible. These carriers and their air groups fought in every major campaign of the late war, from the Marianas to the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They survived bombs, torpedoes, and kamikaze attacks. The USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs in March 1945 and turned into a raging inferno, yet it was saved by its crew's heroic damage control efforts and was able to steam back to the U.S. under its own power. The Essex-class carriers were not just weapons platforms, they were symbols of America's industrial might. The ability to build so many of these complex, powerful ships in such a short time was something Japan's shipbuilding industry simply could not match. The Essex-class carriers were cities at sea, with crews of over 3,000 men. What was daily life really like for the sailors and airmen on these ships, living for months in crowded conditions under the constant threat of sudden, violent death? The carriers were the prime targets for kamikaze attacks. What is the full, unwritten story of the psychological impact of these suicide attacks on the crews? And with so many carriers built so quickly, were there design flaws or construction shortcuts taken that were covered up and only corrected in post-war refits? Number 3, how do you make a bullet smart? Anti-aircraft fire during the early part of the war was largely a matter of luck. Gunners would fill the sky with exploding shells, hoping that a plane would fly through the cloud of shrapnel. The chances of actually hitting a fast-moving, maneuvering aircraft with a single shell were incredibly small. To shoot down one bomber, it could take thousands of rounds of ammunition. There had to be a better way. The solution was one of the most brilliant and secret inventions of the war, the proximity fuse. The official name was the VT fuse, with VT standing for variable time. The concept was to create an artillery shell that didn't need to physically hit its target. Instead, it would detonate automatically when it got close to it. The challenge was to build a tiny, rugged radio set, a transmitter, and a receiver that could fit inside the nose of an artillery shell. This radio set had to be able to withstand the immense shock of being fired from a gun, an acceleration of 20,000 times the force of gravity, and the rapid spin of the shell in flight. It seemed impossible. The project was managed by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSARD, led by Vannevar Bush, and the primary research was done at the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory under the direction of physicist Merle Tuve. It was a massive scientific and engineering undertaking, second only to the Manhattan Project in its complexity and cost. Thousands of scientists and engineers worked on the problem. They had to invent new miniaturized vacuum tubes and batteries that could survive the launch forces. The final design was an ingenious piece of microengineering. A small radio transmitter in the shell's fuse constantly sent out radio waves. When the shell got close to an aircraft, the radio waves would bounce off the plane and be picked up by the receiver in the fuse. As the shell got closer, the reflected signal would get stronger. When the signal reached a certain strength, it would trigger a switch that detonated the shell. The VT fuse was first used by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific in January 1943. The cruiser USS Helena shot down a Japanese bomber with the second salvo of proximity-fused shells. The results were so good that they were almost unbelievable. The fuse dramatically increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. Some estimates suggest it was 3 to 7 times more effective than the older timed fuses. The proximity fuse was a crucial part of the defense of the Fast Carrier Task Force. It was the final lethal component of a layered defense system that included radar to detect the enemy, fighter planes to intercept them, and massive anti-aircraft fire from the ships. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the proximity fuse was responsible for a huge number of the Japanese planes shot down. It was also devastatingly effective against the kamikaze attacks later in the war. The wall of exploding steel that these fuses created around the fleet was a kamikaze pilot's worst nightmare. The existence of the fuse was one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. There was a strict order not to fire it over land where a dud shell might be recovered by the enemy. George S. Patton, the famous Army general, called the proximity fuse the most important technological innovation of the war, even more so than the atomic bomb, because of its widespread impact on conventional battles. The book The Deadly Fuse by Ralph Belknap Baldwin, one of the scientists who worked on the project, details the incredible scientific race to perfect this weapon. It was a perfect example of science and engineering being applied to solve a specific military problem with devastating results. The proximity fuse was a top secret project. How many other secret weapons projects of similar scale were undertaken during the war that either failed completely or were never used? Their files still locked away in archives. The fuse relied on delicate vacuum tubes. What was the failure rate of these fuses in the field, and how much did the effectiveness vary based on weather conditions or other environmental factors we don't fully understand? And with such a revolutionary technology, were there debates within the high command about where and when to first use it, fearing that its secret would be revealed too soon? Number 2, what happens when you build the perfect bomber? The war in the Pacific was a war of tyranny of distance. The Japanese home islands were thousands of miles from any major Allied base. To bring the war directly to Japan's industrial heartland required a new kind of weapon, a bomber that could fly higher, faster, and farther, with a heavier bomb load than any that had come before. That weapon was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was the most technologically advanced and expensive weapons project of the entire war. It cost over $3 billion to develop and produce, more than the $2 billion spent on the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. It was a quantum leap in bomber technology. It was the first bomber to have a fully pressurized cabin, allowing its crew of 11 to fly in relative comfort at altitudes above 30,000 feet, far above most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was powered by 4 massive Wright R-350 duplex cyclone radial engines, each producing over 2,200 horsepower. These engines were a marvel of engineering, but they were also temperamental, prone to overheating and catching fire, especially in the early models. The B-29 was also defended by a revolutionary remote-controlled gun system. The gunners sat in climate-controlled compartments and aimed the plane's 10.50 caliber machine guns using computerized sights. It was a sleek, beautiful, incredibly complex machine. The B-29s were based in the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, which had been captured in 1944 specifically to serve as B-29 bases. From there, they could just reach the major cities of Japan on 15-hour round-trip missions. As mentioned earlier, the initial high-altitude precision bombing campaign was a failure. It was General Curtis LeMay's switch to low-level, nighttime incendiary raids that unleashed the B-29's true destructive potential. The B-29s became the instruments of the firebombing campaign that devastated Tokyo in '66, other Japanese cities, crippling Japan's war industry and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The B-29 represented the culmination of American air power theory. It was strategic bombing on an epic scale. The logistics of the B-29 campaign were staggering. It required building the largest airfields in the world on Tinian, and a constant stream of fuel, bombs, and spare parts shipped across the entire Pacific Ocean. The Japanese had no effective defense against the B-29. Their fighters could barely reach the B-29's operating altitude, and their anti-aircraft guns were largely ineffective. The B-29 flew with near impunity over the skies of Japan in the final year of the war. And of course, the B-29 had one final war-ending role to play. It was the only Allied aircraft capable of carrying the atomic bomb. Special B-29s, part of the 509th Composite Group, were modified for this secret mission. These modifications included removing the armor and guns to save weight and installing a new bomb bay to accommodate the large and clumsy atomic weapons. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29 Boxcar dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. The B-29 was not just a weapon of war, it was the delivery system for the weapon that ended it. The B-29 was a notoriously difficult plane to fly, especially early on. How many B-29s and their crews were lost not to enemy action, but to engine fires, mechanical failures, and takeoff crashes that were underreported to maintain morale. The decision to switch to firebombing civilian population centers was a major ethical shift. What were the closed-door arguments and debates among generals like LeMay and his superiors in Washington that led to this brutal but effective strategy? And given that the B-29 was designed to be the ultimate conventional bomber, what other non-nuclear super weapons was it designed to carry that were never used as the war came to a close? Okay, number one. Can you put the power of the sun in a box? This is the technology that casts the longest shadow. It changed not just the outcome of the war, but the course of human history. It was the culmination of decades of theoretical physics, a massive secret industrial project, and a terrifying moral gamble. It was the atomic bomb. The story of its creation is the story of the Manhattan Project. This was a top secret program started in 1942 to develop a nuclear weapon before the enemy could. It was a collaboration of the greatest scientific minds in the world, many of them refugees from fascism in Europe, working under the direction of the U.S. Army and General Leslie Groves. The scientific director of the main laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, was the brilliant and enigmatic physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The science behind the bomb was based on the principle of nuclear fission. The idea, first understood in the late 1930s, was that if you could split the nucleus of a heavy atom, like uranium, it would release a tremendous amount of energy. If you could create a chain reaction where the splitting of one atom causes others to split, you could create an explosion of unimaginable power. The Manhattan Project had to solve two enormous technical problems. First, they had to produce enough fissile material, either enriched uranium, uranium-235, or plutonium. This required building gigantic industrial complexes at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, which at the time were some of the largest factories on Earth. Second, they had to design a device that could bring this material together into a critical mass to start the chain reaction at the precise moment required. The scientists at Los Alamos designed two different types of bombs. The first, nicknamed Little Boy, was a gun-type device. It used a conventional explosive to fire one subcritical piece of uranium-235 into another, creating a critical mass. This was the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The second design, Fat Man, was an implosion device. It used a sphere of precisely shaped conventional explosives to crush a subcritical core of plutonium, squeezing it into a critical mass. This design was much more complex and efficient. A test of the implosion device, codenamed Trinity, was conducted in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. It was the world's first nuclear explosion. Oppenheimer famously recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The decision to use the bomb was made by President Harry S. Truman. The war in the Pacific was still raging. An invasion of the Japanese home islands was planned for late 1945. Casualty estimates for this invasion, for both American and Japanese lives, were horrific, running into the hundreds of thousands or even millions. The argument for using the bomb was that it would force Japan to surrender immediately, thus saving more lives than it would cost. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb detonated with a force of about 15,000 tons of TNT. It destroyed the city and killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following months and years from injuries and radiation sickness. On August 9th, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people. On August 15th, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Second World War was over. The atomic bomb was the ultimate tide-turner. It ended the deadliest conflict in human history in a blinding flash of light. But it also introduced the world to the atomic age and the constant, terrifying possibility of nuclear annihilation. The book The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes is the definitive, epic story of this scientific and human drama. It was the final, terrible technological answer to the question of how to win the war. The decision to use the atomic bomb is perhaps the most debated military decision in history. Were there credible signs that Japan was trying to surrender before the bombs were dropped, and were these signs ignored? The Manhattan Project was a race, but how close were the Japanese to developing their own nuclear weapon, and what happened to their scientists and research after the war? And finally, the most chilling question of all, having used this weapon once to end a war, what is to stop humanity from using it again and ending everything?